In general, overall, I view the Iraqi economy as being resilient. I don't view it as being particularly strong. It doesn't have the base industries. We are resilient. We have survived, wars, ISIS, oil crashes, but a strong economy to say has diversified revenue. It has a proper financial sector, banking, loans, etc. But we really have to focus on building a strong Iraqi economy. So agriculture, steel, petrochemicals, industry in general, and financial sector, private sector, these are all important. The mainstream is still huge in Iraq. Even in social media, you're seeing platforms, political, social, cultural. So any movement basically that you can map within Iraq has now a new media platform dedicated to it. You're also seeing some kind of individual influencers dictating a lot of how the narrative is shaped in Iraq. So you're seeing, people just opening up their selfie camera and saying whatever the news is to people in a comprehensible, digestible way.
Jameel Amir, welcome to Majlis Markets.
Thank you so much, Hassan, for having me. Huge fan of your show.
Jameel, this is really a privilege for me because I think I was just telling you offline, I've been following your podcast for a while. And, I think we first connected maybe about a year ago. I got to know your podcast for a mutual friend of ours who's actually been on the show as well, Zahra Shah, shout out to her. But she was telling me about your podcast. And then because I was doing some research as well on the Iraqi economy for an article. And, I came across your podcast and I was like, wow, this is actually like a really sophisticated show that a young person in Iraq is doing this. And I really want to talk to you about that and the Iraqi podcast scene, talk to you about your thoughts on Iraq as a young person growing up in Iraq and living in Iraq. But Jameel, just as an icebreaker, tell me your story. What's your background story?
Right. So again, thank you so much. Huge fan of the show, and the privilege is all mine, frankly. I don't get to have context about all these markets that you guys are covering with Majlis Markets. So it's always a privilege to be able to listen and to be in touch with the man at the helm. My background has basically been my first job was in 2020. I was applying for places to intern at as a student. And so I found one of the postings was at an institution or organization called The Station at the time. And so this was in the beginning of, let's say, the COVID moment for Iraq, where people figured out, okay, we need all our services and businesses and products done digitally, done online, right? There had been a few apps, experiments here and there of online products, not majorly successful, not hugely successful in either one of them. And so the station was the first incubator in Iraq. It was based in Baghdad, and they were looking for interns. And I did indeed apply. I got accepted. I became the social media intern for the station. So my job was basically to meet the entrepreneurs behind the startups, behind the new ventures that were starting in Iraq at the time in 2020, 2021. Some of them became big names in the startup space and the tech space in Iraq. So what I basically did was, handle a camera or mobile phone most of the time and, just do interviews with them, quick interviews, quick insights, posts maybe. And then I would turn these into either stories. So on our IG, we had the stories feature. It had just been introduced, I think, and also for posts. And then this did indeed become a moderately successful kind of series where then we thought, with the team at the station, with my supervisor at the time, Lubna, we said, let's turn it into a mini doc series where it's basically video documentaries, 15, 20 minutes with these entrepreneurs, and we'll explore their stories, right? And this also turned out to be a huge success, had great engagement from the organization's fan base and community at the time. And so I once, came up with this idea. I said, okay, this is doing well. This is building a community for this tech incubator that was at the time in its early beginnings in Iraq. Why don't we turn it into a proper podcast where we interview the Iraqi entrepreneurs behind the now household name brands in the country and explore their story, 60 to 90 minutes, because the context behind my short interviews wasn't really getting to the listener. So for example, you're listening to this story of someone who built their startup in a post written, right? You can't really relate to them. You can't say, okay, I can do this as well. Right. But when we did it in a video documentary kind of way, they saw the body language, the emotions behind what the person was saying. And so many Iraqis viewed this and said, okay, I can become like this guy or gal, right? This is realistic for me. This is tangible. And so I said, why don't we scale this and turn it into a full-on podcast? And so they were very interested. They were very intrigued by the idea. They said, however, one thing is with podcasts in general as a medium, it's that it's casual in its nature, right? There's back and forth between the guest and the host. And so we can't really take on this risk as an organization. We have to really vet the host. We have to vet the guests, etc. And so, you know what? We'll support you. We'll provide you the space. We'll provide you the equipment, whatever support is needed. But this can be under your name, right? And we'll enter as a sponsor. And so I said, that's a really good deal, right? But then I did get distracted. I stayed for just a bit under 1.5 years there. And then I moved on to Belly. Belly was a venture backed by Rocket Internet. It was aimed at being Iraq's #1 ride-hailing app, food delivery app, and eventually now super app. And so my role there as one of the first employees within the company entailed marketing, entailed performance marketing. I managed the company's launch campaign, its budget, which was decent at the time. I was only like, I think 17. And that really taught me how to work within a very small team with world-class people in a challenging environment and in a challenging sector within this environment of Iraq. You know, ride-hailing is still one of the most competitive sectors, if not the most, in the startup scene in Iraq right now. You're seeing many players entering, you know, spending millions, some of them leaving, some of them, you know, exiting to other players. So this was interesting. And then as I reached the end of my also relatively brief tenure at Belly, I thought, okay, why not I start working on this podcast idea of mine, right? And that's how Tajarib started. I started recording in around 2021. And then we went on. We produced the first 5 episodes. It attracted the interest of Zain Iraq, which was one of the leading telecom companies in the country. They said, we like what you guys are doing. I believe they reached out at the time. We would like to be part of this. And so we were more than eager. We were more than excited to work with them. We did, in fact, they sponsored the first 10 or so episodes of Tajarib. And then also one of the leading fintech companies in the country, Keycar. They have the leading mobile wallet in the country, over 11 million users. They said, we love what you guys are doing, you know, highlighting the stories of entrepreneurs in the country, etc. We also want to be part of this. So they came in and they sponsored us until very recently. And yeah, it's now turned into this full-on platform where we discuss business stories in the country, economic news sometimes, and we bring on whatever we think is a good success story, or even sometimes failure or challenging stories within startups, within tech, and now more broadly, the general economy and even sometimes economic policy.
MashaAllah, that sounds like a really great background. And, you know, they always say like things happen at the right time and it's always in God's plan, right? And all the stuff that you've said seems to have like really worked at the right time. You know, you started off at the station at COVID time and then you worked at Bali with Mateo and all these guys. So it seems like you've been in the right place at the right time when all these things took off, right?
Definitely. A huge part of it was luck, you know, meeting world-class people generally, whether they're at the station, whether they were at Belly and Rocket Internet at large. As you said, Mateo, Martin, Munqidh, all these guys, it was a privilege, right, working with them. And also, you know, as a very young person, consuming some of the wisdom they had, right, having been through all these experiences working with international firms, etc. Maybe I'll touch on this later, but you don't get that always as an Iraqi. It's really rare to be able to interact with these kinds of people, and it leaves an impression on you for like years to come.
Fantastic. And tell me more about Tajarib, like the podcast. Like you said, you started this as a project whilst working at the station, right?
Yes.
Tell me, what is like? Give us a little bit more. Like, what is it, and how did like give a bit more detail? How did you start it, and what was the mandate behind it?
Yeah. So I started recording episodes during my time at the station, and then I kind of had them on the like back burner, and then actually focused on publishing them and editing them. I had my first episode; it stayed like 9 months in my HDD until I edited it. But yeah, so Tajarib basically started as my kind of attempt at meeting the change makers, let's say, behind Iraq's economy. You know, all these huge big names I had been hearing of. I wanted to know the backstory, right? And I wanted to kind of humanize these stories to a degree where it's like, okay, how do I get to this point? And that was a huge part of it. And that still is to this day like a huge motivation. Like, especially in Iraq, it's a very nascent market. And so the success story that you see staggering success stories. Like you don't just see, let's say, gradual rise success stories. You see, no, someone started here and then suddenly he's there, which is fascinating, right? So what gets a person to that point? And also, what are the traits that are required for this? Lessons, challenges, how do you overcome these challenges? So that's a huge education to me and my friends at the time when we were listening to these episodes and when we were trying to get these people in. And yeah, it's scaled, yeah, alhamdulillah, quite decently. Now, we used to start it with only, let's say, tech or startup or let's say corporate kind of interviews. Now it's scaled into like everything covering the Iraqi economy. And so tech, obviously, and startups, but also Tajarib is now composed of 3 seasons. One is the original Tajarib, where we bring in these stories and we try to dissect them. But also we have Tajarib's energy, oil and gas season, where we focus on energy executives in Iraq, energy founders, because that constitutes more than 90% at this point, I believe, of Iraq's economy. So it would be absurd, right, if you do an economic podcast in Iraq and you don't include that. And also Tajarib stocks, where we cover Iraqi equities, bring in specialists, investors, analysts. We don't have equity analysts in Iraq per se, but we have similar things. And also, we hope to start bringing in like company executives, so board members, etc.
And you don't have like a journalism background or anything. You just decided to do this.
Yeah, I had a very short stint actually at one of so my work at the station also included the station had its own journal that it published for its international partners and donors at the time. So I used to write some articles there. So I had kind of a very brief background, humble background in how you write an article, how you write a media message. I think academically it's and also I had a very short stint at Iraq 24, which is, let's say, the CNBC or Bloomberg of Iraq. So it's the kind of the traditional media, but more into expanding into modern avenues like social media, etc. It's one of the better TV stations in Iraq, a very institutionalized one. So that's...
And, I was just saying to you offline, I really enjoy listening to your podcasts. It helps me with
Thank
my
you.
Arabic language skills, listening skills, and also the Iraqi dialect as well. Because I think you do most of these in Arabic, right? You don't do them in English that much.
Yeah, I think we do maybe every 6 months we do one in English, because most of our guests are Arabic speakers. But sometimes you get, let's say, a foreign executive or someone who's, even founders sometimes who founded businesses in Iraq who don't speak Arabic. So you get that sometimes. So that's okay.
And most of would you say like a lot of your listeners, majority of your listeners are in Iraq, right? Or they're in the Arab world?
Yes, obviously, majority is in Iraq. We do get listeners from the Arab world in general. We do get listeners from the GCC. We do get listeners also from the world, but obviously the majority is Iraqi, and maybe to an extent, to a degree, people interested in the Iraqi market, like yourself. You want to learn more about how this place operates, etc. So maybe you find this useful, and it also, sharpens up your Arabic, which is not too bad actually.
You're too kind. But wallah, the episode that really got to me was the one you did with Ali Alawi, who was the former finance minister of Iraq. You've done, I think, also with Mohammed Khudairi's father, who was actually one of the first guests on Majlis Markets way back 2 years ago. You've also done one, I think, with the Iraq Sovereign Wealth Funds head. So you've got like a big stellar, like real like heavy hitters as guests. Which guest? Like, I know this is a bit of I don't want to put you on the spot. Was there one guest that you remember the most?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of you to say heavy hitters and all, and I can't ask you the same. I know you would struggle to give an answer when it comes to, obviously you have ones in mind, but in the end, I mean, everyone has a unique kind of experience. I don't want to give you the traditional apples and oranges kind of answer. I will just say that I've had obviously a few guests that leave me, really interested. They leave an impression, right? One of them is, as you said, you mentioned Aziz Al-Khairi, Ammu Aziz, we call him endearingly. When we had that episode, he was obviously a world-class, stellar guest, right, in his experience, in his insights. One of the oldest family businesses in Iraq, with the patriarch, let's say, still active and handling the business day in, day out. But what also stuck with me was the guests, interest in our work, right? Like, it's not always you get guests who are saying, okay, how long have you guys been doing this? What do you guys do exactly? How do you make money, right? I mean, some would find it intrusive. I did actually find it very endearing, I think, that someone cared. I mean, I'm a really young guy, right? I'm interviewing this really established person. And so it showed me that, people get to where they are in life because of their curiosity to a large extent, and in many cases, because they want to understand how the world works better. This was one instance where that happened.
Growing up, Jameel, was there any podcast that you listened to, like whether it's an Arabic one or an international one? Was there one that you thought to yourself, I really like this and I really want to do something similar to this?
Yeah, so I used to listen a lot to How I Built This with Guy Raz. I still enjoy watching some of the episodes, especially for the companies I'm actually interested in knowing the story of. I think that was the main one. I also was listening to a few podcasts, generally about finance, about markets and how they work. I still listen to whatever Bloomberg produces. It's always, insightful, nuanced, right? So that was also a huge inspiration, to be honest. But I also enjoyed even like growing up watching, the really simple podcasts like Joe Rogan, right? To this day, like I'm a huge fan.
Amazing. And Jameel, how many listeners does Tajarib have today, would you say?
Yeah, so it's really segmented because it's segregated, sorry, because you have around 5 or 6 platforms, depending on if you count TV or not, that we have our viewers and listeners on. But overall, we have around 250,000 followers across platforms. Each episode of ours reaches around 4 to 500,000 people on average in Iraq. Our total lifetime accumulated reach, we've probably reached close to like half of the population of Iraq, if you count it this way.
Amazing. And Jameel, would you say I started Majlis Markets as an audio only podcast, but then I quickly realized that a lot of people would find out about the podcast through like video, especially like shorts. So it sounds like from when you started in 2021, like you decided to be video enabled first. Is that right?
That's true. That's a really good point because I thought that at the time, we as Iraqis didn't really have the culture of, listening to something that's audio only. It's partly due to human nature. You want to listen to someone whose face you can see, right? It induces some kind of trust, right? Or at least you can apply your personal biases on the way that person looks before you start listening to what they say. And so we did, in fact, indeed launch with video. I believe we are the first video podcast to have been launched in Iraq. There had been a few ones that were audio only, but I think the fact that we started with video really helped out. And I still to this day, like I have a kind of have a hard time, listening to things that are audio only, unless they're like really short, like 15, 20 minutes, or they're really good, like these acquired interviews. I really enjoy them. Maybe these are the only ones that be able to bear the audio only.
And would you say like a lot of your listeners or your audience are found via social media, via shorts, or do you think like a lot of them do actually watch the full YouTube?
I think, if I'm not mistaken, we have 80 to 90% of the reach is shorts and reels, right? Probably only 10 to 15% of the reach is through the actual long form videos.
Okay, that's interesting. Because the one thing that stuck into my mind was when I was last night watching the one you did with the Sovereign Wealth Fund guy. I think the first question you asked him was like, what do you think about podcasting? Or do you listen to podcasts? And he was like, I don't even have a TV or something along these lines. He was saying,
Yeah, it's true.
convincing the older, like, I guess, like, did you have any pushback or any kind of skepticism from the older generation when you told people you were doing this?
In terms of what, podcasts or short form, you're saying?
The podcast.
Podcasts, obviously, older generation in general, they're a bit skeptical about public appearance in general, not just constricted to podcasts. Yeah, I think that's the main concern. It's not about the medium itself. It's about appearing in general and having your image and video in the public domain. It's a bit intimidating to most, especially older generation, because we don't have super positive connotations of media in Iraq. If you're on media, it means you did something bad. And so maybe that was the main concern. But most of the older generation had no ideas the podcasts existed, so they can differentiate them from.
Yeah, like I was thinking, like, you being a young person and, although you've had this experience working at the station and some of these other places, did they take you seriously when you would ask them, like, oh, I wanted an interview with, getting an interview with someone like Ali Alawi, who was the former finance minister? I mean, that probably didn't happen in a vacuum, right? That happened over a long period of time.
Yeah, that's true. So obviously, a huge part of, getting our guests is our track record. Right? Maybe at the beginning it was a bit annoying. It was difficult to get people on. And it's like the pitch is interesting. Like, okay, I'm this guy, I'm doing this podcast, I want you to come on, etc. But even then they had we always reached out to people who had something to gain by appearing, right? And even those who didn't were generous enough, frankly, with us to say, okay, you know what, I'll give you guys a shot. When it came to people like Professor Alawi, obviously it had been only after a long track record, so let's say at least 2 years of working, of doing this, that we then came to them. We reached out, and we reached out where we have done our homework, right? We've read basically all of his books. We've watched all his lectures, economic lectures, and even theological lectures, and then deciding, okay, we want to get in touch with him. And it also happened through a warm connection of his, who's a guest we've probably had as well. We've previously had. So that also factors into this. So we do our research. We try to always not reach out, just cold outreach. It's not ideal. And we try to do a good job always. We try to make it worth their time. And alhamdulillah, I think so far we have to a great degree.
Well, you've done a really great job. And, even people can tell you in the UAE, bankers, lawyers, people who have an interest in Iraq do. I've mentioned it to them, and they also are aware of the podcast. But Jameel, where do you want to take Tajarib? Do you want to make it into a media brand across the Arab world or internationally, or what are your plans with it?
Right. So I think the vision right now is to basically build out a comprehensive media platform within Iraq. So how do we become not the CNBC of Iraq, because another entity is already doing that and doing that quite well, I would say. I mentioned them, Iraq 24, who we have a partnership with right now. But I would say becoming the morning Brew of Iraq would be interesting. So the new media equivalent of CNBCs and the Bloombergs of the world, how do you get to that? I think this is where we look at the future. This is where we see the future. So basically, how do you take this complicated news, complex news, and dissect it to listeners? Because Iraq is a very early market, and so the graduates, the fresh graduates of the country, they have no idea what's going on. Including me myself, when I started out my career, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to specialize in, what to start. And so if you just give them this resource where it's okay, this is what's happening. Here's why this stock is rising. This is why this CEO, resigned within Iraqi companies, within the local context. This is huge for them. And it's also huge for the institutional players who want to position themselves as being close to them or as sending some kind of message that they find important.
And have there been any times where you've had to deal with sensitive topics or topics which you thought were not covered in the traditional media in Iraq?
So sensitive as in, are we saying political, cultural, or strictly economic?
Or political, or something where a lot of people, it's known, but isn't covered in the media so widely.
Right. Yes. We've had these moments, obviously. Yeah. Some of them. So it's interesting because some of them you just say, okay, how do we phrase this in such a way? We try to do this with our episodes, with our conversations, where it's okay, we want to make the listener aware that we are aware of this, but we don't strictly or necessarily want to say what this is exactly. And so this is a point we make with our guests. It's okay, so this huge elephant in the room, how do you point to the elephant without describing the elephant exactly? This is what we try to do. And sometimes, obviously, it doesn't go super well, where you have to say, okay, I think we described the elephant a bit too precisely. Maybe this is not ideal. Oftentimes, this doesn't happen because it's an economic podcast. We try to touch on business, but economics and the economy and business in Iraq is heavily, heavily interlinked with the politics. The political economic machine of the country is everywhere. You see it everywhere you go. So it's difficult to manage, to be very frank. But we try our best. We try our best to be truth driven.
Very good. And this is part of, I would say, a wider phenomenon across the region. I've interviewed some podcasters from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and other countries as well, and the UAE and the Gulf countries. And how would you? Yeah, you touched on it a bit earlier, but the current podcast scene in Iraq, it's still quite nascent from what you're saying, right?
Oh yes, it's very early beginnings. Early innings of the podcast scene in the country. I would say it started in 2020 with COVID. You actually had people, staying at home, quarantined. And so the first idea was to say, okay, what's going on in the region or the world? And we saw podcasts as Iraqis, and we said, okay, let's try this out. And you saw the audio podcasts, you saw the video podcasts then come out. slowly but surely. Now we kind of are at a point where I think we're slowly going to have, our own Joe Rogan. Some people think we do. His name is Salah Mensi. It's a podcast called She Mensi, right? And so it shows you that the medium has definitely matured throughout the years. And even interestingly, you see the recent elections in the country, late 2025. Podcasts were very influential, as they were obviously in the US in 2024. And so you saw many officials come up on podcasts, outline their vision, where they see the country, what their policy is. And you saw many people have, huge impact through that. So many people did win elections because of podcasts, and many people lost elections within the podcast. One of the interesting cases was the Minister of Telecommunications in the country, or communications, we say in Iraq. Her name was Siam al-Yasiri, Victoria al-Yasiri. And so she was one of the few figures who had, I don't want to say an antagonistic view of telecom companies in the region, in Iraq specifically, but she had a different policy in mind. She said Iraq will found its own national telecom company called the Fourth Company. We had three main companies, and this is how it's going to manage its telecom industry from here on out. She was also always in brawls and fights with the local telcos. And so mainstream media wasn't her best friend, as you can probably tell. All of them, most of them, let's say, had a decent incentive or motivation to side with the telcos. So what she did was actually go on to podcasts and use podcasts as her main platform. So she appeared on Tajarib. This was her first appearance. And then she appeared on She Mensi. Then she appeared, I think, on one or two more podcasts. And most of her audience, it was very well received. She succeeded quite well in that, actually. Became the most voted woman, I believe, in recent elections. And you saw maybe 3-4 other elected officials. They succeeded this way.
Amazing. And Jameel, you mentioned a bit earlier on about the mainstream, the traditional media, the old media. As someone who comes from a mainstream media background, I've been a journalist for about 13, 14 years now. I've realized that the new media is, a lot of people have a distrust for the legacy media, let's call it. Do you have any thoughts on the new media in Iraq and where it's going?
Yeah. So obviously mainstream is still huge in Iraq. Even in social media. So I would say a good chunk of a person's daily consumption of media is still to a large degree mainstream media, but social media. I do think we are seeing a good rise of new media. We have seen already a new rise of media in Iraq. You're seeing platforms, political, social, cultural. So any movement basically that you can map within Iraq has now a new media platform dedicated to it. Some of them are disproportionately successful, which is how you measure success in media. And some of them are as successful as their mainstream media arms, right? And you're also seeing some kind of individual influencers dictating a lot of how the narrative is shaped in Iraq. So you're seeing, people just opening up their selfie camera and saying whatever the news is to people in a comprehensible, digestible way, which is also huge. It's becoming huge. We saw recently one of them, and his father died. And so he got a call from the prime minister, sending out his condolences, saying his heart's out. You don't expect this to be just for an individual influencer, right, who's saying the news. So you're seeing a huge shift in how this is working. And also you're not seeing TV channels per se having a huge influence anymore, but what you are seeing is streaming platforms rise up. You're seeing new streaming platforms in Iraq, namely 1001, Al-Manassa, Key TV as well. So these are, I would say, they don't deliver specific or real info or news, but they shape narratives in a huge way. Many of what are now Iraq's pop culture, popular culture, icons, slang, idioms, etc., are now shaped by shows produced by these platforms. And so it really plays into what narrative Iraq wants in the future.
So you think culturally they play a big role with the Iraqi youth population?
Yes, streaming platforms are definitely, they have a huge role right now in Iraq, because they're producing the leading blockbuster shows and series, especially in Ramadan, etc. You're seeing a cultural impact here.
Yeah, no, if you look at a country like Saudi Arabia, for example, I'm not sure if you're aware, but Thamania, which is a podcast producer in Saudi, they actually broadcast the Saudi National Football League games, and they're quite influential. They've interviewed the Saudi Foreign Minister, the Saudi Finance Minister, and in addition to other people as well. I think the most viewed podcast on YouTube is from Thamania,
That's
which was
true.
interviewing somebody, right? So there's definitely some influence there. Because like if you look in the United States and even the UK, a lot of traditional media people like Piers Morgan, Tucker Carlson, Mehdi Hassan, these kind of people that have always been traditionally in the mainstream, written or like broadcast journalism, but now a lot of them have pivoted or added podcasts to their repertoire. So no, it's quite interesting to see this shift because you think, right, podcast has been around for such a long time, but I think like in the way it's accessible to a lot of people now in terms of making them, they're much more cheaper to make than they were, say, like 20 years ago when podcasts first done by Apple, right? So
So no, it does empower alternative narratives. It does to a huge degree.
yeah, sure. Jameel, I just want to shift gears a little bit, talk to you as a young person living in Iraq, because I think it's not every day, like you get, we in the West or we outside of Iraq don't get to chat to us, a young person who's so plugged in. You know, we've had Ahmed Tabakshari on the podcast. I think he's the second most viewed on our YouTube channel. A shout out to him. We'll hopefully get him on the podcast soon. But what's it like growing up in a place? You're in Baghdad, I'm assuming, right? You live in Baghdad.
Yeah.
What's it like as a young person right now in 2026? If we take out the Iran situation right now, what's it like being growing up in a place like Baghdad?
Right. Obviously, so growing up and living day-to-day life in a place like Baghdad, Baghdad is, in terms of Iraq, it's a very metropolitan considered city. It has, I think at this point, 14 million population, which is huge even internationally, I would say. And so it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming the amount of traffic and just day-to-day life. And it's amplified by the lack of planning generally in how Baghdad works, right? And I think you see this in many cities around the world. I would say sometimes you look at it, it's a bit frustrating, to be very frank, daily life in Baghdad. It's not easy. The things that should be basics generally are quite difficult to get a hold of. Electricity, just health, education, etc. And so it's frustrating when you listen to what your parents lived in Baghdad in the 70s, let's say, maybe the 60s. They give you these tellings of how life used to be. Much better back then, much more systemized. And also it's difficult if you travel. If you're even like half decently well traveled, you will know that Baghdad is not on par with basically any destination around the world that has basic services. And so this is really hard. On the other hand, you see that this also gives you huge opportunities everywhere. So any problem you see, any inconvenience you see, any difficulty you see in Baghdad is an opportunity in some way, one way or another. And everywhere you look, everything you look at, if you have some context about what's going on in the world, around, in the region even, you see, okay, this is an opportunity for a startup, this is an opportunity for a business. And, that gives you a lot of ambition, that gives you a lot of motivation as well. And I always try to tell friends, whether they're based in Iraq or whether they're not based in Iraq, but want to, do something that gives them meaning, right? I say, you know what, we have this issue, come and solve it. I mean, you have decent execution skills. You have a good background. I encourage you, and I think it's, frankly, to a lot of people who are well-educated, traveled, well experienced within companies, it's a waste for them to just be employees. I would say, you can own your own thing and focus and be fixated on solving a certain problem in Iraq. And there are unlimited problems within Iraq to solve. And so that's what gives me my meaning day to day. It's seeing, okay, there's a problem I'm trying to solve, which is the information problem for young people, for people just entering the private sector and economy of Iraq. And that gives me a lot of motivation in the day. And the nice thing is feedback loops and cycles here are much faster than you would see elsewhere. And so you can see the impact of your day-to-day work, in real time and in real life. I get people that go up to me and say, oh, we love this, we watch this, right? And that's a huge thing.
Why do you think, unfortunately here in the West, we still, it's been over 25 years since we invaded, I'm sorry for that, invaded Iraq with the US. It's been we invaded Iraq as the UK and the United States and other countries. But I guess like why do you think Iraq has a really negative? Because in the UK, I'm going to be honest with you, a lot of people still have a negative view on Iraq. I think those who are not Iraqi or who know about the Iraqi ecosystem and things, they still have this like very negative perception. Why do you think that is?
I wouldn't say it's unfounded. I mean, Iraq still has lots of challenges. It's very difficult to operate here, to be very transparent. However, I do think there's a nice delta between perception and reality. And I say to my friends, like, this is where we play. This is where our role comes in. We make money off of that delta, because Iraq is hard and it's difficult and it's challenging, but it's not as hard and difficult and challenging as people make it out to be. Like, it's not exceptionally difficult or challenging. It's on a scale between, let's say, countries in the region and Iraq. So most of the difficulties you will face with bureaucracy, with bad infrastructure, with etc., you will face to varying degrees in other countries. But I think you will have better. And I think it's, when you talk to investors, they will tell you they have better returns in Iraq in exchange for this headache than they do elsewhere. So I think definitely it's, so reasons I would assume is that we don't have a really national narrative when it comes to, marketing Iraq. The idea of a unified Iraq, of a single Iraq, of a single directing, orchestrating entity, telling the story about this country is still not there yet, I would say. Even in media, you see that national Iraqi media isn't in its best state, but what's performing really efficiently is party-funded media. And so each one on its own, the party-funded media can do a really good job, but unless they're really unified on a single message, they won't deliver the message, and they aren't motivated to deliver the message to the international community that Iraq is a good place, it's a safe place, it is indeed safe, and it's an investable place. That's not really on its main list of priorities. Its priorities are basically pitching its own ideology, etc. And so I would probably say it's because we don't have a really unified media ecosystem that delivers this story, whereas most in the region do.
Given where we are right now in April 2026, we've got a war going on with Iran and the US and Israel. Right now, how is the economy, in your, being on the ground in Baghdad, how is the economy in Iraq at the moment, would you say?
So we are in a bit of a, I wouldn't say downturn, but it's more people, being conservative with their spending, obviously, because we don't know how this will end and how this will look for Iraq. In general, overall, I view the Iraqi economy as being resilient. I don't view it as being particularly strong. It doesn't have the base industries. We are resilient. We have survived, wars, ISIS, oil crashes, but a strong economy, to say, has diversified revenue. It has a proper financial sector, banking, loans, etc. It has infrastructure, and it has a robust private sector, which doesn't. It doesn't. And so I would say we will, inshallah, we will pass this, right? But we really have to focus on building a strong Iraqi economy. So agriculture, steel, petrochemicals, industry in general, and financial sector, private sector, these are all important. And I don't think we'll get to a point, I don't know, I really would hope that we get to a point where Iraq becomes a viable investment option, even when compared to other countries in the region. But maybe when all of this comes to an end, we will have been 2, 3, 4 decades late. And so maybe we can't be as competitive, but I think we can pass this turmoil. We can come through on the other side better than before, more resilient, and hopefully just a bit stronger.
Yeah, one of the things Ahmed actually mentioned to me is that, since 2019, the economy seemed to be doing a lot better with the security situation and the political situation, albeit, had its challenges. But compared to previous years and decades, it was much better, he was saying. And the other thing we talked about a lot, which I'll link in the show notes, but we did about digitalization. So I know Iraq's been trying a lot to digitize some of the sectors, right? How do you think that's going so far?
I think it's been going excellent, to be fair. I hate to, give the government props, but the government, and partly also due to international interest in this being the case for Iraq, has been successful in digitalizing, let's say, a good chunk of the economy, at least in the last 4 years. It's good for 4 years. You're seeing e-payment, you're seeing more banking, you're seeing digital wallets, really high digital wallet adoption. Now, obviously, there are some places in Baghdad where you can't pay, only accepting cash. But at least for me, the places I'm now going, the coffee shops, the restaurants, the co-working spaces, right? Yeah, most of them are accepting cards. And for the regular Iraqi as well, they are seeing more adoption, especially when it came to, receiving your salary by card or by bank. This has been happening since 2017, but it's been amplified and sped up and accelerated from 2022 onwards, when the Fed and the Treasury were really interested in increasing transparency within the Iraqi financial system. So now I think a really tiny minority only now of the public employees in Iraq receive their salaries by cash and with cash, and definitely a very low minority receive it in the private sector in cash, unless like obviously you're a really small business. And so this really incentivizes people to start testing out e-payment, accept it, use it. One issue though you're seeing in most e-payment companies and banks, also any financial institution, is how do you get that now salary to stay on said individual's card or bank account, right? Because there's this culture of the moment it drops in your account, you can withdraw it, right? Because you don't have any trust in the financial institutions that are managing this. And so how do you convert that into actually, no, you keep that money in your account, you deal with services, you buy things through that money, right? So now a huge focus for any company or institution within the financial landscape of the country is providing value-added avenues for this money, this electronic money to be spent. So whether it's e-commerce, whether it's digital products, or whether it's tickets, whether it's experiences, whether it's anything, services, how do you really create an ecosystem where an individual is motivated to spend that money on their card instead of withdrawing it the moment they receive it? And this is also applying now to new products that are being introduced. So you're seeing buy now, pay later solutions being introduced to add that as a kind of an incentive. You're seeing savings products, installments, loans, potentially even investment platforms. Also, CBI is helping with this, it's the Central Bank of Iraq.
One thing you mentioned just now was the lack of trust in financial institutions. Is that down to the lack of quality of service, or is that down to something like religious reasons, like to do with interest, or what's it to do with?
I think quality of service is a huge one. And also, the history, right? Financial institutions in Iraq don't have a stellar history. You've seen post 2003. I'm not sure how many. I have to do my research on this, but I think 3 or 4. We've seen 3 or 4 banks be bankrupt and not bailed out. So this was a huge issue. Only in 2020, I think the Iraqi government introduced what was it called? Could you remind me? The federal thing where they, insure basically people's deposits, up to $250,000 or something.
The federal guarantee scheme, yeah.
Sorry?
A federal guarantee scheme. I don't know the precise name,
Right.
but something along this line, but the government guarantees the deposit.
Yeah, deposit guarantee. So, the Iraqi Deposit Guarantee Company, I think they named it, they coined it, where it basically guarantees people's deposits. So this has only been introduced in 2020 and it hasn't been stress tested yet, really. We don't have a major bank institution get bankrupt. And so that's a huge reason why, because of past experiences. And a huge part of it also is possibly service. I think that's a part of it as well. People don't see the service being presented at banks being stellar. So that's also a huge part, because most banks are incentivized to, tender to the big clients, to the institutional ones, not so much individuals.
So, Jameel, one of the things I wanted to ask you as well is that it sounds like you're quite heavily involved in the startup ecosystem in Iraq. What do you think right now the biggest opportunities are for startups in Iraq?
So I would be biased in saying fintech, because most of my interactions have been with fintech founders, fintech businesses. Our sponsors were fintech corporates, but I think still fintech has a long way to go in Iraq, still has huge opportunities. Yeah, I mean, so any product that includes saving, any product that includes lending, any buy now, pay later solutions, we haven't seen this huge disbursement of this tech in Iraq. I would look at it very similarly to AGI, for example, where you have the technology cracked, the technology bit, but it's still, how do you distribute it and how do you get it to reach everyone? So you have e-payments and you have financial data of a great amount of Iraqi consumers. It's just about how you take advantage of it. And this enables people, it enables businesses, it enables individuals to a great extent. I would say fintech and also the hands-on businesses. So let's look at logistics, let's look at transportation, looking at especially last mile delivery has been a huge sector in Iraq that's still been it's not saturated yet to the degree that one would imagine looking at it. So that's part of it. So basically building the rails for e-commerce in the country and e-payments. Yeah, I think that's part of it. And yeah, digitizing what's existent. So anything that's being done now manually, it's done offline, which is a huge chunk of what day-to-day life in Iraq is. Just transforming it online. But I would say fintech and logistics are still very ripe for innovation. We've seen a lot of innovation in e-commerce. We've seen a lot of innovation in and consumer-facing offline businesses like ride-hailing and food delivery, but we haven't seen a lot in these sectors, and especially also B2B side within those businesses.
And then conversely, the challenges. A lot of people say that it's very difficult for scale-ups to get financing because they can't go to Series A and B because there's not that many deep-pocketed investors. Would you say that's one of the biggest challenges still today?
Yes, it's a huge challenge. Founding a business in Iraq. So obviously just getting a seed investment, a pre-series investment, even a pre-seed investment is a huge challenge. Getting it locally is possible, but it's really difficult. Getting it regionally is, you must have very high hopes to get to that point, because regionally people don't really look at Iraq right now as a huge destination for investments. Oftentimes you'll hear the phrase Iraq is not within our mandate, very simply. And locally also, there are always concerns about, how do you invest, the legal framework for investing in Iraqi businesses is still not really there yet. And also, rule of law is a huge problem. The trust in the rule of law in Iraq, locally and regionally, is an issue. So yes, you can get initial investment, you can get your Series A. Usually it's not Series A, usually it's like seed investment or pre-seed, but getting to the B and C is extraordinarily difficult. And that's why Iraqi companies eventually get acquired instead of seeking a Series B or a C. They integrate into one of the groups of companies, and that's how they start to get their funding. And obviously that's not ideal. They won't move as fast as they like to, and they won't get the funding they actually would have aspired to seek. And we've seen that implemented. Obviously the results have not been shabby at all. They have been good, decent results. But you always have to look at the alternative and see, okay, why aren't we seeing more successful startups coming out of Iraq? And the huge reason for that is funding, as you said.
Also, I think not just in Iraq, but in the region generally, there hasn't been a big track record of exits, right? The only one that comes to my mind is Uber acquiring Careem in the UAE. So there hasn't been like a big track record of like a lot of exits for investors, right? So it's still early days, I think.
Yeah, so completely true. And this is, maybe we'll get to that part later on within the ecosystem development part. But I think venture studios are a huge part of the solution to this, where it's like they're not, hands-off VCs or investors. They're actually going into the deep and for the operations of their companies. That's a big part of it. And I think this is how we will solve that problem in Iraq in the coming years. But maybe we can get into that later.
But to say that, Jameel, I still think that the ecosystem compared to where it was even 5-6 years ago, it's come a long way, from where it was even before.
For sure. Yes, I think you see now VCs in Iraq, local VCs, you see a few VC firms, you see more of a, cultural awareness or understanding within Iraqi investors of, okay, what's a startup? How do I invest in it? To a great degree, but you still, these very, when you look at it regionally or globally, they're small events. So looking at, for example, what's happening right now, it significantly slows down VC activity in Iraq. So Iraq, is not it's not insulated, and whatever happens in the region, it reflects on Iraq, and it reflects a lot because you don't have a very robust banking system. You don't have a very robust VC ecosystem either. So things like this, and even, let's say challenging experiences in Iraqi startups. So for example, an Iraqi startup comes in, has this experience where it's not, doesn't get its Series B or C, and that becomes then the black horse for all other startups or businesses, even though they did their best, they did excellent, right? So that's not ideal. And because you don't have so many startups, launching and being started, this becomes your selected, group of companies that you judge the entirety of the ecosystem by. So it's a tricky situation, but I think obviously, inshallah, we'll get out of it. There has been no person with, will and passion for building something actually good that, didn't get to that. I say always, it's whether it's by Series B or C, whatever it is, or by getting acquired by a company, whatever, the means, you get it done as a founder in order to expand your business and to achieve and realize your vision. Unfortunately, it's a bit more difficult in Iraq. Many will not, spend 5, 10 years and then own their own company and operate it as they would like to. But that's the reality of operating in this kind of market.
For sure. Jameel, just to finish the podcast as we close, it's very good news that Iraq qualified for the World Cup that's taking place in the next few months over in the USA, Canada, and Mexico. How did you feel when Iraq qualified, when they beat Bolivia?
Excellent. Didn't myself, have this great deep belief that we will get into the World Cup. And I don't think most Iraqis have. I think it taught everyone here something interesting, which is that, we Iraqis have this exceptionalism. I think it's Iraqi exceptionalism. It's negative. It's very negative, unlike American exceptionalism, right? Where it's like, okay, we are exceptionally doomed not to achieve great things, right? Which is not true. I mean, we're not insulated from the region, and we're part of the puzzle that is the Middle East. And so I remember, this is a pop culture moment. It happened in Iraq where an analyst, I think a few weeks prior to the match, he gave this really funny story where he said, imagine this blue whale or hunchback whale, whatever it is. It's the largest organism known to mankind, right? And he brought a pin to the studio. He said, and there's this pin. So if that whale goes through the spin, maybe then and only then Iraq will qualify for the World Cup, right? And it achieved huge, resounding success at the time, this soundbite, this excerpt. And so the moment we actually got and qualified for this was a really funny one where it's like, yeah, I think the whale went through that pin and it will, inshallah, for many times in Iraq's future. Iraq is a young country. It's a really young country. It's still very early beginnings for it. And, we've had these decades of turmoil and instability, but now we have a good, at least, let's say, decade of decent stability, of decent prosperity for all Iraqis. And it shows you that, maybe the future does have, bright things in store for us. And I hope so. And I pray for that to be the case, inshallah.
And if Iraq go... I don't know if Iraq has the team to win the World Cup, but if they go far, how big would that be for Iraq?
So if you did see the celebrations we had for just, qualifying for the World Cup, I don't know. Allah yastur, as we say. I think it would be a huge moment. If we went, only, a prime minister said it, we qualified, but we want to prove, our place there. We want to go one match, two match. Why not? I mean, we deserve it. Obviously, we're not in a easy competition, going up against, Norway, France, Senegal, right? But, the whale went through that pin once. It might, twice, and we pray for that. Why not?
Jameel, tell us any projects you're working on, any upcoming projects you can share with us.
So obviously, my main focus right now is Tajarib. Building out Tajarib to be the platform we hope it can become. And I do some consultations on public relations for a few Iraqi companies on the side as a personal thing. I'm also investing more and more and being very interested in stocks. And so I think you'll see more of that in Tajarib, in the coming days, inshallah. I think it's a fascinating market and it deserves someone to take a real shot at introducing it to the wider scope of Iraq.
Amazing. And how can people reach out to you who are not in Iraq, who don't know about Tajarib or about yourself?
Sorry, can you go again? I think your voice just cut off very slightly.
I was just saying, how can people who are outside of Iraq and don't know too much about Tajarib, how can they reach out to you?
Yeah, I'm happy to drop my email, jameel@tajarib.show. Happy to write it if you have anywhere written for it. Tajarib is spelled Tajarib. Would love for anyone to reach out, exchange ideas, maybe. Why not?
I'll link it in the show notes. But Jameel, this has been a really great conversation, really wide-ranging. I'm really happy to learn about your story and what's happening with Tajarib and what's going on in Iraq from an Iraqi perspective, not just from an analyst sitting in London or the US. But this has been a really great conversation, and I hope we can get through this again sometime soon, inshallah.
Thank you so much, Hassan. I really appreciate your time, your questions, and I hope we can see you here someday.
Inshallah. Inshallah.
Thank you. You too.